Season 2 of Inside the Therapy Room. I'm your host, Sam Sellers. I'm a registered therapist, a wife and a fur mama, and I am passionate about breaking down the barriers and stigma attached to therapy. I want to begin by first honouring the traditional custodians of the land we live and work on. Today, Jemma is on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung people, and Sam is on Gundungurra land. We pay our respects to the elders past, present and emerging, for they hold the memories, the traditions and cultures of our First Nations people. We must always remember that the land below our feet is, was and always will be Aboriginal land. Today, I'm chatting to Jemma Mathers, who is an accredited mental health social worker and accredited EMDR practitioner with a background primarily in specialist sexual assault and family violence services. Jemma is incredibly passionate about using evidence-based practice to support female-identifying humans, children and adolescents to thrive, whilst assisting them to deepen their connection to themselves. She is particularly passionate about working with complex trauma and has an interest in dissociative identity disorders. Jemma primarily uses attachment-informed and relational EMDR, animal-assisted therapy, and parts work, and approaches therapy from a compassionate, person-centered approach. Jemma works alongside co-therapists Dexter and Marley, who are both qualified therapy dogs. Outside of Bloom, Jemma enjoys spending time in nature, visiting the ocean as often as possible, traveling to new places and hanging out with her partner and fur kids. As you may have guessed from Jemma's bio, today's episode is all about EMDR. We hope you enjoyed joining us inside the therapy room. Welcome, Jemma. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
I am excited about this episode because I think that it is something that a lot of people sort of know about because they know the acronym, but they don't necessarily actually know what it is.
Yeah.
So you are here to chat about EMDR.
That's right.
And so let's kick off with what is EMDR?
Yeah. So it's a type of therapy that is commonly used for originally it was kind of designed to treat PTSD. So when people were returning from the war, EMDR was being used with war veterans as a way of helping them to reduce the distress associated with the experiences that they'd had while they're away. Now it's being used more broadly across the spectrum with people with anxiety, depression, OCD, phobias, so many different presentations, and it's only just growing, really. So what it stands for, because it's an acronym, is eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It is not EDM, like my clients often call it. And I sound like I'm doing some crazier therapy with dance. I'd love to, but that's not quite it. So it's EMDR. And what it really looks like in the room is we're using bilateral stimulation. So stimulating both sides of the brain in an alternating way to move memories that are stuck, haven't been able to be naturally processed by the brain. We're using the brain's natural healing mechanism to move that memory into either our, essentially our long-term memory, where it can be stored without the distress that has been attached to it.
Okay. Now, people may know the, I'm glad they acronymed it because it's quite a mouthful, isn't it?
It is.
But people will know the terminology REM sleep because it's used a lot in sleep apps, right? So people sort of know that. And so can you sort of explain how that is connected to EMDR?
Yeah, sure. So REM sleep is what we know of as that if you've ever had a sleepover with somebody and you've noticed their eyes kind of flickering side to side, that's the REM sleep. So what's happening is that the brain is using bilateral stimulation to move what's happened during our day. So let's say I go to the supermarket and there's all the normal things that happen in my day, and they're getting processed at nighttime and sorted, kind of like a Harry Potter sorting hat, into short-term
I
or
love that
long-term
reference.
memories. But when they're distressing, they can get stuck. And so that's during that phase of our sleep, the brain's trying really hard to move it, but if it has distress attached to it, it might not be able to move straight into the sorting hat. It might need some extra help. And so that's where EMDR comes in, because what we're doing is we're replicating what happens in REM sleep by, think of the therapist like a guide or a facilitator, because it's actually the client's brain doing all the work. We're not. We're just facilitating, kind of like the bumper rails when you go bowling. We're not the person actually doing the bowling. We're just kind of keeping it on track.
And so a lot of people tend to think, because I guess EMDR, like you said, gets largely lumped in with trauma therapy.
Yes.
And so a lot of people are afraid of trauma therapy because they think that it requires retelling and retelling and retelling. Now, EMDR does not do that, because I've had EMDR myself. So I know that it doesn't require, you know, copious amounts of retelling of your story. Why is that not needed?
Because all we need is for we just need activation in the body. So we don't need to retell the entire story, because the body already knows the story. And we already know the story. So all we have to do is for the memory to be activated enough. And what I mean by activated is, I like to describe it, particularly to my child clients, as feeling alive in the body. So what that might look like is, if I've been in a car accident, for the car accident to be alive or activated in my body, I might be feeling the somatic feelings that I had at the time. So maybe there's tension in my shoulders, maybe I'm bracing for impact, maybe I hear some really loud noises, maybe I feel really overwhelmed, like auditorily. So it's the somatic sensations being alive in the body. And so I might notice that as anxiety. I might not be able to verbalize it as anything other than a beating, my heart's beating really quickly, or I feel breathless, or maybe I feel sweaty. So I don't necessarily know at a cognitive level that's what's happening, but as the therapist, it's my job to screen and make sure that's what's happening. And so I think that can be where sometimes people's experience of EMDR hasn't gone. The most common way that we see EMDR not go well is when it hasn't been activated enough. So we don't want to fall too far on either end. We don't need to overactivate, and we don't want to underactivate. So it needs to fall somewhere in the middle. But that's my job as kind of the facilitator, to keep it in the sweet spot.
Yeah. And so, I mean, I think that conversation around the fact that we have known for decades that trauma is stored in the body, but I feel like it's really picking up speed in the last few years. I don't know why that is, whether it's just social media and people having access to information. But I think it's really helpful for people to know that that retelling is not pivotal and vital to your healing process.
Definitely, because I think you're right. That's one of the number one reasons that people might put off seeking support, because they think that that's going to be what's required. And look, there are some people who choose to come in and they want to retell their story. That's important to them, but it's not important to us in the same way. We're not going to ask that of clients. And I don't think anybody who practices in a trauma-informed way should be asking that of their clients. We know that based on the research and the science, that isn't effective unless it's of importance to the client.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that, I mean, I obviously specialize in religious trauma, and a role of that is that people lose their voice. And so there is a really important role in healing from that, in actually being able to use your voice and tell your story. But it's, distinguishing between whether, is this something I feel like I should do because that's what, you know, the therapist is requiring, which if they are, find a new therapist.
Yes. Please.
Just a little side note. Or because you feel obligated in some way or something, or is it an actual need to have, to retell that story or to have your voice heard? Before we get into the nitty-gritty of EMDR, what drew you to this modality? How did you come about it?
A good question. I think I was lucky, to be honest, because I don't know if I was particularly drawn to it initially. I was working for an agency that where I was in a specialist family violence therapeutic program. So it was as a result of the Royal Commission into Family Violence in 2016 in Victoria. There were a number of pilot programs that were then introduced as a way of trying to decide what's the way forward for the therapeutic work in the family violence space here.
Okay.
And so one of the programs that I was in was called Restoring Childhood. And we were, as part of the program, everybody who was in it, every practitioner that was in the program was trained in EMDR therapy. So they paid for us to go and do both level 1 and 2. And at the time, I probably didn't know how great that was. And because I was fairly new-ish to, like, that was my first proper therapeutic role. And prior to that, I'd been working in the family violence space, doing a children's specialist therapeutic role, but it was less therapy and probably a lot more hands-on. And so, yeah, we all got trained in EMDR, and then there was a couple of people in the team that were also trained in CPD, so child parent psychotherapy. I think I got the CPP, not CPD.
So many acronyms in the therapy world.
Yeah, and so that was how I fell into EMDR, and I could see that it worked, I guess, because it was part of our program. It was very I don't know how to describe it. Like, it was quite short session, so it was a brief intervention, and there were a lot of outcome measures that we used to track how things shifted, and I could see that things were shifting for clients. And I was like, hey, this is pretty cool. And then after that, I moved to CASA, which is a Centre Against Sexual Assault here in Victoria. And they're the only specialist sexual assault service in Victoria. So that was my primary presentation, and we weren't allowed to use it at CASA. So I'd done this training and used it for just over a year, and then I wasn't allowed to use it whilst there.
Was there a particular reason?
Yes. So at the time, and this has since kind of shifted and changed in the landscape, but at the time there was some real perceptions of how EMDR was understood to be in the court systems. And because a number of our clients would potentially need to go through court processes, there were other CASAs using it at the time that I was at the CASA I was at, but the CASA I was at made that decision that it wasn't to be used. So it was partly a managerial perception, and partly rooted in what was happening in the court system.
In the legal side,
And then when I went into private practice, I was like, hey, I've got this cool training that I haven't really got to use a lot of, and I'm really keen to get back into it. And then, I think my love has grown for EMDR since being in the private practice space, because I've been able to really use it how I wanted to use it in a way that's integrated with other therapies, and see the benefits for clients.
And I would imagine for a much more diverse group of people and presentations, because, private practice means that you can attract basically anybody that is within your scope of practice. And so it's not just, family violence or, things like, or children or things like that. So is part of the training that you receive EMDR? Is that part of it?
No, it's not.
Interesting.
I did learn the other day that play therapists have to do a minimum number of hours to pass there. I think that could be a really great introduction for all therapies. I know as social workers, we didn't have to do any of our own therapy. I do think that would
Wow.
be a really great addition to definitely psychology courses,
Yeah.
but also social work courses, counseling. I think that
Mm.
any modality where we're working therapeutically with people, that it's a good idea. Like, I've gone and done my own therapy, but that's been out of my own
Yeah.
motivation to do that, so that my stuff doesn't get in the way in the room.
Mm.
But I know that there are a lot of people that I've worked with over the time that haven't done that as well. So,
Right.
and like, that's their choice, but I think that it would be great to bring that in
Mm.
as a standard, really.
Absolutely. I think especially with, specific modalities like EMDR or,
Mm.
even IFS or brain spotting or, all of those different things, because it is so specific.
Yeah.
You want to be able to know what it is like to sit on the other side of the couch, so to speak.
So,
Um,
as part of the practicums for our assessments in the training for
mm,
EMDR, we did have to practice on other people and receive
mm.
EMDR, but it
Okay.
was with other people who were still learning how to use
Right.
it.
Okay.
So yes, you did, but it was also very limited in terms of what you could bring to
Yeah.
that space, because you're in a imagine a really big
Like
room where there's
simulated.
20, 30 other therapists, and you're practicing on one another. So you
Super
bring
nice and
something that's
private.
quite manageable. Yeah. Yes, it's not private. So, and you're also bringing, quite contained things. So
Yeah.
it's your choice to then go and seek that stuff out.
Okay.
And then I've done further training in EMDR. So I've done the level 1 and 2. I've then
Mhm.
gone on to become accredited as a practitioner, which is then an additional step.
Yeah.
And then I've also gone on and done attachment informed EMDR, and
Mm.
both level 1 and 2 of that,
Okay.
and relational EMDR.
Nice.
So both relational EMDR and attachment informed EMDR both also have practicum components where
Okay.
you're practicing on each other.
Yeah.
And this is more experienced EMDR
Mm.
therapists.
Yeah.
But again, it's still limited
Still
in terms of what
contained.
you bring, because it's
Mm.
a training scenario.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. So if we circle back to,
Yes.
I guess, what about what EMDR is? You said bilateral stimulation. Can
Hmm.
you sort of give a bit of an overview of what that is?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's so many different things that it could
Yeah.
be, and it does look like in the room. So it's not, at least in my room, some
Yeah.
people practice in different ways, but in my room, it's really depending on the person that I'm working with.
Mm.
So I have, we call them buzzies. They're like little, I'll get them, but they're like little buzzing Doritos,
Oh my
and
God.
they vibrate, and then the client can either hold them or put them in their socks or shoes.
Wow.
So that's the buzzies.
Oh,
And so, yeah, you hold on to them. For children, I put them in their socks
yeah.
or their shoes or their pockets, because they're going to be quite movement based. So we're
Yeah.
moving around the room a lot, so that they've got extra bilateral stimulation somewhere on their person, and
Yep.
we're doing something else. For adults, they might just hold on to these. That might be enough. For other adults, we need to give more. And
Mm.
so I use something like this. It's a light bar,
Yep.
and the light moves from side to side.
Mm.
And so it simulates what Francine Shapiro originally designed, which was the fingers, which
Finger.
most people would be most familiar with,
Yeah.
moving from side to side
Mm-hmm.
in kind of a, for people who can't see, like a vertical way. And then sometimes if
Do
things
you
are
mean
getting a bit,
horizontal?
yes. I always get them
That's okay.
around the wrong way.
I get it confused all the time in a horizontal fashion.
In a horizontal fashion, yes.
Yes.
Side to side, and then occasionally you'll go from top corner to bottom corner.
Okay.
You interpret for me what that
Yeah.
movement is.
Diagonally.
Diagonally. I'm a social worker. I'm not
Yeah.
great at that stuff. And yeah, so it really just depends on what's happening.
Okay.
Another tool that I use in the therapy room, often for bilateral stimulation, is clapsticks, if that's
Oh,
what's
that's cool.
appropriate
Yeah.
for the client. And so they can use these, they can hold them, they can clap them together, they can move them up and down like they're running kind of on the spot. They can use stomping, they can use clapping, they can do something called the butterfly hug, which is where we interlink our thumbs and we tap with our fingers. I can use a slinky where I go from side to side.
That's very creative.
This is my very small slinky, so it doesn't quite work with this one. But with the large slinkies, you bounce it from side to side.
Yep.
Ball, might throw ball backwards and forwards, or from left hand to right hand and backwards and forwards. We can also use sound. I have these headphones that I use, and the sound alternates between the earmuffs. Realistically, bilateral stimulation can look like anything. If you're creative. And you don't have to go and buy fancy equipment. You can just use what you have in your room, but some of the fancy equipment is also pretty cool.
Yeah, absolutely. I didn't actually even realize that there was like fancy equipment that you could use. I'm like, that's really cool.
Yeah.
My experience of EMDR was actually online. So and you touched on something which I think is important, which is that you can have multiple forms of bilateral stimulation at the same time, right?
Yeah.
I know this because I needed 3 for my brain to actually do anything. I had the finger, like my therapist on the other end of the screen doing that, but I was also tapping my thighs side to side, and my feet were going as well. And so what is the reason that people may need multiple forms?
Yeah, so we describe that process as taxing the working memory. And so what we're trying to do is we're trying to apply enough load or enough pressure that pressure's not quite the right word, but we're trying to tax it enough that we can move that memory into the long-term memory, like I was mentioning before. If there's not enough, it's not going to work. It's not going to shift enough. And another reason might be somebody like yourself, I'm going to make some assumptions, is quite an intellectual person, so they can be quite in their head. And so when I see therapists, like other therapists for EMDR therapy, as clients, they can find it really hard to like take a step back and be in the client's seat for a little bit. And so we might need more, we might need to tax them a little bit more than I might a client who has no idea what I'm asking them to do, and they're just blindly following my instructions. Of course, I've explained to them what EMDR is, but they've got less expectations around what this process might kind of generate, versus a therapist who might have gone and read all of possible articles and consumed all of this stuff and has all this knowledge about what EMDR should look like, which is great. We want people to be informed, but it sometimes can get in the way in that sense. So we might have to work a little bit harder, or they're working a little bit harder. We might instruct them to work a little bit harder so that we can help them switch off and really come into their body rather than being in their head.
Yeah, okay. And they do say that doctors make the worst patients. It is the same about therapists. We make the worst clients. My therapist would not have said intellectual. He probably would have used the word stubborn, that my brain has been too stubborn.
No.
So I think it's important, because if people go to see an EMDR therapist and you think that you're only going in and it's just going to be the one thing, and they start to get you to use other things, you're not doing it wrong.
No, and you're not broken. There's nothing wrong with you. And we need to use different things in different circumstances. And that's our job. Our job is to assess what's needed here.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, we've obviously touched on trauma. And I think most people associate EMDR with trauma therapy.
Yep.
What else is EMDR used for?
Well, lots of presentations. Like I said before, there's anxiety, there's depression, there's OCD, there's phobias, there's pretty much anything that you could think of. There's probably a protocol, an EMDR protocol for it.
Yeah.
And let's also remember that not necessarily everybody would identify their experiences as trauma.
Yes.
So often people have been given labels either by their GP or they've self-diagnosed or whatever the reason is, but they've been given this label. That doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't trauma somewhere in there.
Yeah.
It just may not have been identified, or it may not have been labeled that way. And maybe they haven't yet had the time to process what this actually means.
Yeah.
Just as an example, working in the sexual assault space, the stats obviously that there's like 1 in 4 female identifying humans will experience sexual abuse in their lifetime. But when we ran workshops, it's like high 90s statistically, people will experience sexual harassment. Well, sexual harassment is actually sexual abuse. It's on the continuum, but people wouldn't necessarily identify that as sexual abuse. But when we ran workshops, obviously they're primarily female identifying because it's a helping profession, attendees wise. But we never had a single person attend who wasn't able to identify, once we had explained what sexual abuse looked like on the continuum, not be able to raise their hand.
Yeah. Which is mortifying.
Mortifying.
Like, that's awful.
Mortifying. But how would that actually look if we had a broader understanding of sexual abuse and really understood the intricacies of what it looked like, that it's not, I'm going to use a word that can be triggering for some people, rape, that it's not just rape, that there is a broader spectrum of other experiences that come under the category of sexual abuse. So if we had that understanding, how would that change how we worked with that? So I guess what I'm saying is that some people could present with what they think of as anxiety. And when we do EMDR, we go back in time and we end up at an experience, and it doesn't have to be, like I said, rape. It could be an experience where there wasn't consent obtained, or they felt uncomfortable and their boundaries were violated, or there was an experience of sexual harassment, or there was an attachment rupture. Those things are all traumas. But we don't necessarily categorize them that way because we often rely, particularly when we're young, on the people around us to categorize our experiences. And it's much easier to categorize a car accident or something as a trauma versus some of those things that might happen in private, behind closed doors, or with very few people around.
Or that's relational. And, relational trauma, it doesn't look like a big bang event. That's happening over time. But I think sometimes that comes back to the fact that unless you think that trauma is the event, when we know that trauma is not the event. Trauma is what happens inside of you as a result of what happens outside of you. So I'm reading a book at the moment, and she describes trauma as anything that is too fast, too hard, or too soon, which is really great. But I think it's shifting our perspective of the fact that trauma is not the event. It's not the abuse. It's not the neglect or the bullying or, whatever it is, insert X, Y, and Z. It's your response and your nervous system's response to what's happening around you. And I think that most people at some point or another have gone through some level of trauma on a spectrum, obviously. But okay, so I'm going to throw a curveball at you because I've just thought of it as you were saying. But I often will see people group these two things together. Now, I obviously know that they're not the
Mhm.
same thing. How is EMDR not hypnosis?
Yeah.
Because I
Um,
know that they get
it's a
grouped
good
together.
question.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So I'm not trained in hypnosis, so I can't comment on what the training process looks like.
Yeah.
But in terms of empirical evidence and science, there
Yeah.
isn't a scientific base for hypnosis.
Mhm.
Yes, there are people who report that hypnosis is helpful for them, and so I can't discredit those experiences. But in terms of science and empirical evidence, there isn't a scientific backing for hypnosis, whereas there is for EMDR.
Mm.
And that there is 8 phases for EMDR. So
Mhm.
it's not just the
Yeah.
bilateral stimulation that people see, which my understanding of hypnosis is that that's largely what it's about.
Yeah.
And we are not changing memories. So we're not let's say, for example, Sam, yours is that fan. Let's say the trauma is associated with that fan. So
Yeah.
that's our target. I'm not asking you to change
Mm.
that fan. I'm not asking you to forget about it. I'm not asking you to anything in any way change that memory. What
Mm.
we're doing is we're reducing the impact of that fan on you.
Yeah.
So um, that I would say is the big difference is we're not
Mm.
changing things, we're reducing how it impacts
Yeah.
us. And that there's a different scientific
Yeah.
backing behind EMDR.
And I guess that's where the D comes in, right? Because it's about desensitization. And, when
Yes.
my therapist was explaining to me um, about it, it's at the moment, it's right here, like it's right in
Yes.
front of your face, and it's like
Yeah.
impacting absolutely everything.
Yeah.
That memory will stay exactly the same. It won't change, but we want it to be in the distance. We don't
That's
want it
right.
to be right in front of you, like wrapped around you.
Yes.
And so you'll still feel grief, you'll still feel
Yes.
sadness, you'll still feel those emotions, but
Yeah.
it's trying to desensitize you from them so they're not having, for some
As
people, a
big an impact.
day-to-day
Yeah.
impact. Yeah,
Yeah.
it's not crippling you.
No.
You'll think about it and you'll hold it differently, essentially.
Yes. Yeah.
So, but yes,
And the
my
belief about
understanding,
yourself
yes,
too.
yeah,
Yeah.
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 But yeah, my understanding of hypnosis also is that it's trying to, I guess, alter the memory somehow,
Mm.
or alter
Mm.
whatever, if it's a phobia or something like that, to change your perception of it.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I think it's a good distinction to make, because I think often people see, I guess, the bilateral stimulation as like an altered sense of consciousness almost.
Yeah.
But I was very much in control of, I
Yes.
knew what was happening. I knew what was going on. I knew what my therapist was saying. You are not in an altered state of consciousness
No.
by any means.
No.
So,
You're present and you're part of it because like I said,
yeah.
you're leading it. It's your brain doing the
Yeah.
healing and we're kind of just the people keeping things on track.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Absolutely.
it's a great explanation you gave around the memory or the image because you are never going to forget whatever it is that we're working on. And I'll explain that to clients because I think it's really important that they
Yeah.
understand I'm really sorry, I can't take this back.
Yeah.
Like this has
Yeah.
happened. And
Yeah.
there's going to be some grief that's
Mhm.
going to be present because of that. And
Yeah.
let's hold space for that. But
Mm.
what I can do is help how much this is impacting your day-to-day life or the triggers that you experience in your body. We can reduce that.
Yeah.
um, yeah. And then the reprocessing part around what is my belief about myself now? So there
Mhm.
may have been a belief about myself, or there always is. It's always connected to a cognition about myself. And so it's about shifting that.
Mm.
So I might previously have thought um, I'm defective or that there's something wrong with me, or maybe I thought that I was not good enough or not lovable or whatever the belief is. And through desensitization, we're then helping organically, the brain will create a new thought about yourself. And it's not, I don't know if it's new though, because I think that it's always there. It's inherent. It's like a
Yeah.
belief that sits there. It's
Yeah.
just we're allowing access to that
Yeah.
by creating new pathways because we've reduced the distress. So there's more space for that connection to happen.
Yeah, it's like unlocking the key to a room that's always been there that you've just not been able to access yet.
That's right.
Yeah. Is there anyone that EMDR would not suit?
Animals? I've tried.
I'm
really
sure you
tried.
have.
Because my you've probably seen my dogs coming in and out, but Dex can have a healthy dose of separation anxiety. So I have
Yes.
certainly tried. Hasn't been successful so far.
Mm.
There are contraindications. So like when people are on specific medications and things like that, sometimes people with epilepsy, they can't use particular bilateral stimulation. So we can't
so the
use
light
often
thing.
the light or finger movements. We might have to use other types of bilateral stimulation instead. There are other contraindications, but they're probably not as relevant. But the populations of people, no, because there's always different protocols. So for younger children, pre-verbal traumas, for example, there's a protocol for pre-verbal traumas. There's things like the storytelling method where you, which is beautiful actually. I use an adapted one that Sarah Schubert spoke about at the conference, the EMDR conference a couple of years ago. I use that one, and it involves caregivers. So caregivers are part of the session, and somebody's doing the taps on the young person. Somebody's reading the story, and we record it so that they have a copy of it if they want to watch it back later. And that's a really beautiful method because we write a story together. So the caregivers and I will write this story that beautifully weaves in and out some of the difficult or the hard or the traumatic bits, woven in with love or the bits that are really great about this child or the family, and it kind of titrates it in a way that they can tolerate whilst administering the bilateral stimulation. So recently we had a really significant road accident here, and I have done some EMDR with some little people, and so we didn't have to do any talking. We did drawing, and we used the buzzies on their feet, and we talked about other things, and we got really creative in terms of like, what would you like to imagine instead? You know, how could we bring those in as resources? So to be really clear, we're not changing the memory, but we're imagining, could you imagine what's the strongest person that you could imagine? Because in that moment their caregivers weren't able to be present for them because they were just trying to look after themselves. How could you imagine something else coming in? So they had you know, strong characters that they imagined being present instead. So I don't think there are really many presentations that EMDR wouldn't work with. The only one that I can think of really is if you don't want to. Because then it's not going to work. Or people who are finding it difficult to believe in. We can do a lot of work. We do a lot of parts work with those people to try and support them, because parts work really beautifully complements EMDR. And I use ego states, parts work. And in that case, we can work with those parts who are feeling unsure or, you know, protective, and we can work with them. We can invite them to be co-therapists. But at the end of the day, if they're still feeling unsure, it might not be the right fit for them. The other time that EMDR, and when I'm talking about not being the right fit, we're thinking phase 4, because we can always do phase 1 to 3 with everybody. But phase 4 also might not work with really complex trauma, clients if you've only worked with them for a very short period of time. There's a
Yeah.
lot of phase 1 to 3 that we need to do, which includes the history taking, the preparation, the assessment, the stabilization to a degree before we can get in and process heavy trauma.
Yeah.
And some of the categories of people that might come under is like dissociative identity disorders, where we're still working with those parts and getting to know those parts, and we haven't done enough work yet. EMDR phase 4 and onwards might not be the right fit at that moment in time.
Okay. And so I guess I think a lot of people tend to think that EMDR is just like you go in, you get it done,
Yes.
you leave. But,
Yes.
you know, there is still that therapeutic relationship that is needed for it to be as effective as, you know, potentially what it could be. Is there space, because like, you know, we've touched on it already about the fact that a lot of people don't label things as trauma. And so if somebody, you know, it might be self-confidence, self-esteem issues, you know, things like that, where they have those internal beliefs about themselves. And, you know, we're probably sitting here going, there's probably trauma connected to it, but you might not think there is. And so I would imagine it would be really great for people who don't necessarily come in going, I've had X, Y, and Z happen. I need to process that trauma, because that's unlikely to happen, right?
Yeah, that's pretty rare.
Yes.
That we get somebody who's like, I know the traumas I've experienced and I'm ready to address them. Like,
they either do a lot of reading or they're a therapist themselves.
Yes.
So,
more likely it's going to be somebody who's come up. More likely it's going to be somebody who is presenting in that exact way, that they're wanting to feel more confident in themselves. Maybe they're experiencing some challenges around their career. There's so many different ways or they're really anxious, or they're noticing that they're having trouble sleeping. You know, there's so many different ways that could look that we might understand if there's a bit more maybe happening behind the scenes.
Okay, so this is where we get to the last thing that I ask you, which is, what myth are we smashing about EMDR?
I think the biggest one is just that it doesn't hold any different value other than hypnosis. That essentially that there's no backing for it. And in terms of validity, EMDR is recommended by the World Health Organization as one of the leading treatments for PTSD. So I can't quote all of the research, but there's a lot. So go and have a look if you're interested in this space. And EMDR Australia has a lot of different resources on their website. And if you remember, there's also a lot of free journal articles and access to lots of information. And that EMDR hasn't been around for a long time, when in reality, you know, Francine Shapiro developed this back in the 1980s. So this isn't new as a therapy. It might be more new to Australia, in the sense that it was, don't quote me on this, but I think it was earlier 2000s that it came across to Australia. But it has been around since the 1980s. So there is a lot of evidence supporting, and a lot of evidence that has shown that EMDR might get to the same outcome as its a competitor such as CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it happens in much shorter timeframes. So the outcomes are that we might get to the same place, but we get there a lot quicker. So it reduces people's time in therapy, which is really helpful given our very limited Medicare rebates in our country. But also the other really great thing about EMDR is that there isn't really homework. So with other therapies, the homework can be super intense. And there is a lot of demands for people who already have, at times, you know, very busy and full and lives that are still managing the ongoing impacts of trauma, and then they're having to throw in homework as well. So EMDR doesn't add that extra stress, and still gets to those outcomes quicker. So I think that would be the biggest myth. is that
Mm,
EMDR does have a really solid empirical
mm,
base
yeah.
and can achieve really great outcomes, particularly in the space that I'm really passionate about, which is the attachment informed and relational
Mm,
EMDR. The outcomes that I see are even better than standard protocol EMDR.
yeah. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons that I was drawn to it personally, to sit in the client position, was well, I mean, my therapist brought it up as an option, so that helped.
Good
But
job, therapist. Yes.
but I mean, there is never going to be a zero on this, but there is a reduced risk of re-traumatization, because
Yeah.
you're not taking it home and having to do things outside
Yeah.
of the therapy space, like you said, the homework issue, and there's minimal retelling of story, and it's you do that to your comfort level. So I think for me it was that the lower risk of re-traumatization was very appealing to me.
Yeah.
And so I think for people to know that, I think most people would also find that very appealing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And for me as a therapist, I think that it really beautifully integrates with other therapies really well.
Yeah.
So it works really well with somatic, we call
Mm,
them somatic interweave. So it's like
yeah.
interweaving in other bits. It works really well with parts work. Like these two things
Mm,
kind of marry up. And then you can bring in the other different types of therapies that you need. I use a lot of psychoeducation even before I get to phase 4
yeah.
EMDR. So there's when we think of EMDR, we think of it just as the really fun part,
Mm,
which is the processing
actually
stage.
processing. Yeah.
But there is so much more that
Mm,
happens in EMDR, and you integrate it with so many other therapies for
mm,
good outcomes for clients as well.
yeah. Now, before we finish,
Yep.
if somebody wants to find an EMDR registered therapist, where do they go?
Yeah, so there is a list on the EMDR Australia website,
Amazing.
a find a therapist listing. So
Mm-hmm,
that's probably the best place to have a look.
mm-hmm,
You can view by state, or you can put in your postcode and have a look.
mm-hmm.
Otherwise, my suggestion would be trying to find somebody locally and seeing if they have other suggestions.
Yep.
EMDR can be done online, like you
Mhm.
mentioned, your own experience. And there's even cool apps that a lot of therapists use now rather than just their fingers. And so
Yep.
that can appear on your screen. You can, if you have some extra cash, you can also purchase these to have at home. And
Yep.
so your therapist can still control them, but they're
Mhm.
called remote EMDR. So it's a specific type of equipment where you can have the buzzies at home and your
Yep.
therapist controls them. So don't rule out an EMDR therapist just
Mhm.
because they're, not local to you.
Yep.
I understand, particularly in my area being regional,
Mm,
most people prefer to be face to face because they want to know who they're meeting with.
yeah.
Totally appreciate that. But don't rule out somebody in different areas, because I think that if you find the right fit, the relationship is
Yes.
really most of the work. We know that it's 90% at least of the therapeutic
Mm,
intervention and the outcome. So
yep.
finding the right fit for you is really important. And don't be afraid to ask if they offer free 15-minute calls, have a
Yep.
chat to them. And I'm sure that you've got some resources as well, but we also have some resources on our social media about how to find the right therapist for you, and they're free, so that you can go through like a list of questions. And I encourage my clients to think of it kind of like you're interviewing them for a job, because
Yeah.
you are. It's
Yeah.
a job of being a therapist. And if they're a good therapist, they shouldn't be at
Mm-hmm.
all put off by that. They should
Yes.
be able to answer all the questions. So I would start with the EMDR website, and yeah, otherwise,
Amazing.
there's always platforms like Psychology Today where you can
Yeah.
choose the modality
Yep.
EMDR and have a look, because I know that not everybody is registered on the EMDR website, but it's a
Yep.
good way to make sure, because the EMDRA, to be listed on there, they have to vet you. So
yes. Okay. Yep.
yeah.
Amazing. I will pop all of those details in the show notes so people can easily click links without having
Yeah.
to go and Google things. But I'll pop all of them there, as well as every which way possible to find Jemma if you so desire. And so yeah, but thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah, it's been,
Talking all things EMDR.
I know, it's been wonderful.
We hope you enjoyed joining us inside the therapy room. Thanks for listening.